very first podcast episode of Where Knowledge Stems From. My first guest is going to be Francois Cherie. Francois is currently a PhD candidate at Carleton University. He currently studies computational peptides designed under the supervision of Professors James Green and Kyle Bigger. Francois is particularly interested in applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence in biology. In this episode, we discuss Francois' journey into the world of machine learning, computation, and research. We discuss concepts in computer science, machine learning, then delve into his PhD work and how he worked on development of Darwin AI, the algorithm that can selectively design peptides in silico that can target specific protein receptors. We also discussed some pros and cons of AI and spoke about how Francois wants to apply his expertise to work on development of therapeutics for ALS, also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Now, without further ado, my first guest, Francois Cherie. I'd like us to start by having you introduce us to how you actually got to where you are right now.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. I started my undergrad at Ottawa U in biochemistry, and I was actually taking a music major on the side. So I was sort of unsure as to what exactly I wanted to do. I had always been interested in science, and I knew that music was like a big part of my life. So I didn't want to give up on that, but I knew that I had to earn a good income. So I thought, why not do biochem and music? After a year or a year and a half, I decided to switch routes, and I replaced music with chemical engineering, which is what brought me on the engineering road. And after completing my undergraduate degrees in biochemistry and chemical engineering, I thought I would want to find something that maybe had more like software computer stuff in it, because I found great pleasure in learning about, coding and like building computer programs and solving problems using computers. So I decided to enroll in a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering. And I went the course-based route, which is where you don't actually do research, you're only taking courses. And the rationale for that was that, well, I don't have this background in computer science and computer engineering, so maybe I need to prove that I can do it before I can find an advisor that would take me on. So I did that for a year, and then I found the courage to go at the end of one of my classes to go and ask my current advisor, are you willing to take me on as a grad student? And Professor James Green was willing to take me on. So I went with him to his office. We picked out a project that I would work on. Turned out it wasn't actually a biology-related project, which is what I'm doing now. It turned out to be a biomedical informatics project. So essentially I was looking at ways to use AI and machine learning to classify what we call audiograms, which are, in a sense, the result of hearing tests. So that's what my master's thesis was focused on. So the idea was that using this classification tool, we could help non-experts to identify people who need to go see a doctor about their hearing loss or go see a hearing aid specialist. So I graduated in 2018. And then after that, I enrolled in my current program, so my PhD program in electrical and computer engineering, still with James Green, but I'm co-advised by Kyle Bigger in biology. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm about 4 years into my PhD program, and I'm about to start writing my thesis, essentially.
The most exciting part.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had to have some initiative to learn coding by yourself. At what point did you decide that, okay, I'm going to start learning how to code and I want to work on these projects? So did you take the more, let's say, traditional method of picking up a book, learning what Python or some other language, how it works? Or did you decide, I'm going to work on projects 1, 2, and 3, and through those projects, I'm going to learn how to code?
Yeah, so I'd say it was like a mix of different things or approaches. So as part of most undergraduate engineering programs in Canada, you have to take a number of programming courses. And that's what made me really enthusiastic about programming and coding and solving problems with computers. So during my undergrad, I had to take a second year course in C. So essentially, we were taught how to use C to solve simple engineering problems. And that's really when I noticed that I really enjoyed, being able to leverage the power of computers and CPUs to solve problems. So I did take that one class in second year. And then a couple of years later, we were taught another course in Java, which is a different language, which uses a different programming paradigm, namely object-oriented programming. And that class was more applied to engineering problems. So we were simulating, chemical reactors and these kinds of things. And yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I was like, yeah, that was further confirmation that I really wanted to do something that is like computer related or coding related. From there, I just started programming in the evenings, on weekends, and building these small projects or tools. I remember building this program or web application that would allow you to type in the name of an artist, and then the program would go and fetch the lyrics of all the songs by that artist and show you a word cloud. So like what words are most frequent in the songs by that artist. So that was a neat little project, and I built a few more like that. And I did find a number of resources on the web. So essentially there are challenges that people can go through to learn how to code. So like it increases in difficulty incrementally. So like there's some easy challenges at first, and then it gets more and more complicated, and it requires more and more complex programming concepts to complete the challenges. So one of them being the Rosalind website, which is essentially a set of challenges in bioinformatics. And I really enjoyed solving these challenges, and that's how I learned Python, because I had mentioned I had learned C and Java through school, and I mostly learned Python through these challenges on the web. So if you're into biology and you're interested in computers, I would say definitely check out Rosalind.
So then, would you say it's important to learn how the background of coding works, in the sense that to actually understand what's happening when you type code? Or is it just important to understand and learn the syntax and then just let the rest for a computer scientist, for example?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what your goal is. If you want to use programming just as a simple tool to solve problems in engineering, in science, or something like that, well, it may or may not be necessary to know all the details about what's going on inside the computer. But if you're interested in building software that is, for example, highly performant, well, in that case, it's necessary to know the nitty-gritty details of what's going on in the computer, because small details may make a huge difference in how fast your program may run, for example. The different languages that we just talked about, namely C, Python, and Java, they all lie on different parts of the spectrum of what we call language abstraction. So certain languages are low level, meaning that they are closer to what's going on at the hardware level. So you get great control over what's going on inside the hardware, meaning that I know exactly what's happening at that location in memory. I know how data moves from one location in memory to another. And so C being one of the lowest level languages. And Java is just a bit above that, where you do have some control over how the programming is executed, but less so than C. And then Python would be at the highest level of abstraction, where you essentially write something that essentially looks like English. And with languages such as Python, well, you don't have as much control with respect to what's happening in memory. A lot of it is managed for you. So I would say picking the right language and the level of abstraction that you need is going to depend on the application. So if you want to build, as I was saying, high performance software, well, you're likely going to need to go to low level programming languages. And if you want to build some scripts to do something for you, automate something, well, you may not need that, and Python might be sufficient.
And then how transferable are the skills in learning one language to the next?
Yeah, well, it's tempting to say that it's easy to transfer, concepts from one language to another, but the thing is that every language has its own idioms, I would say. So like there are things that you might write in a certain language that may work in another language, but that's not how it would typically be done. So, for example, I may write some code in Python and try to rewrite the same thing in C, but that's not necessarily how it would be done if you were to code directly in C. But I will say that most basic concepts in programming are present in most languages. So I'm thinking about things like loops and conditional statements and functions. So these are present in most languages, and apart from certain syntactic differences, they're transferable. But I don't want to say that it is trivial to go from one language to another.
Right. Then in case of machine learning, are there specific languages that coders use because it offers advantages from one to the next?
Yeah, so typically in machine learning, the language that is used is Python. So Python affords the programmer with the ability to write programs very fast. So there's very little time required to go from, an empty file to something that can run a machine learning model. But that being said, a lot of the heavy lifting is done by code that was implemented in other languages that are much faster. So a lot of the programmers will be writing Python code that actually calls code written in C++, for example. And that is the case with many of the machine learning libraries that are out there today. And I'm thinking of PyTorch and, TensorFlow. All of these libraries are actually in C++. So yeah, Python is really what most machine learning engineers will interact with.
When it comes to runtime versus or running the code versus compiling the code, can you explain the subtle differences, if there is a difference between those two?
Yeah, so there are different ways through which computer code can be executed, and some languages require you to write the computer program and then to compile it, and then the program is converted through that process into what we call an executable that can be run. And that's usually very fast, because the compiler's job is to take the code that's been given to it and to optimize it and make it as fast as possible. And it does that through a set of rules that are defined using formal logic. I'm not a compiler's expert, but I do know that there's a lot of logic involved into making optimizations to source code. So as I was saying, there are these compiled languages, and then there are languages that we call interpreted, which are not compiled ahead of time. So essentially, the programmer will write a computer program, and then they will execute it, and the source code written by the programmer they're going to be interpreted by the computer line by line. So it's going to look at the instructions and run them line by line. And that makes it less obvious for the computer to optimize the source code, because, as I say, it's going from top to bottom. There is some optimization done, but it cannot be done the same way that a compiled language could do it. So there's these compiled and interpreted languages, and both have like pros and cons, right? So like the compiled languages usually will be much faster, but on the other hand, they require the programmer to be much more rigorous about the code that they write. So they need to provide more information about the types of the variables. Is this a number? Is this a string of characters? So that allows the compiler to make these optimizations. But on the other hand, you have these interpreted languages that are slower, but you are given a bit more flexibility in terms of how you write your program. So you don't necessarily to specify what type every single variable is, because it's going to be inferred by the interpreter. So that allows you to write programs much faster than a compiled language where you need to specify everything. So there's this speed of the compiled program versus the speed of development that are sort of the trade-off.
Could you elaborate on what an algorithm is and how it's the backbone or the foundation of machine learning?
Yeah, so algorithms are often described as recipes. So they're like, it's this fancy word that is thrown around that essentially describes a series of instructions. And that can be very simple, from bending over to pick up a pen. So like I bend over, then I grab the pen, and then I get back up. So that's an algorithm to pick up a pen that's on the ground. And that might be an algorithm that is, implemented in a robot. And, a recipe to cook spaghetti is an algorithm. So there are a series of instructions that can convert some sort of input into an output typically. And yeah, machine learning is built on top of algorithms, but every modern computer piece of software is as well. So algorithms are foundational to anything that happens within a computer. And it's very hard to think of computer programs or computer processes that don't involve an algorithm in one way or another.
You would use algorithms, and the purpose of them is to make recipes, right? So I would like to ask you, what is the recipe that you use to write your algorithms for peptides? Because as I understand, you are part of a company called NuvoBio, and NuvoBio focuses on making peptides that can target specific protein receptors. So what exactly do you use, and how does the program work?
So first things first, let's talk about what is a peptide. Essentially, a peptide is a small protein that is very short. So they're mini proteins essentially that are naturally produced by organisms, and they can be used for different things like signaling within the body. And only recently, within the past few decades, have they started to be used more seriously as therapeutics. So I can think of multiple peptides that are now used to treat diabetes or heart conditions, heart failure, for example. And we think that peptides could be a very good drug modality for things like cancer, which is why we started NuvoBio, thinking that peptides could be used as supplements to chemotherapy or radiation therapy. So yeah, that's what I do as part of both my PhD and as part of my role within NuvoBio is I wrote and maintain this software that can come up with peptides that will hopefully bind or interact with a protein target that we're interested in. My program named Darwin works on top of algorithms that are already pretty well established, but we put some twists on them. How I would describe it is that we combine algorithms that were already developed to assess how likely is it that two proteins interact with a famous algorithm in artificial intelligence named genetic algorithms. So we combine these two families of algorithms together to develop this software Darwin that has been successful at generating peptides that can bind to a protein target. So it's very much a case of combining the right algorithms together in the right way that has been successful.
Fascinating. And then those peptides are important because the software aptly named Darwin AI that actually takes these peptides and evolves them through different generations. And once you achieve the desired peptide that can now target a protein, a receptor, something in the surface membrane of a cell, or a different target, how much time are you actually saving in doing that compared to a normal protocol, let's say, where you would just go from taking a bunch of different, let's say, known samples or known test subjects and testing them across different protocols?
You can look at it multiple ways. The first one being, if you use a completely naive approach, well, you could think, well, okay, well, I want to design a peptide that will bind to this protein target. And if I want it to be 20 amino acids long. Well, there are 20 different amino acids that could fill these 20 positions. So you're at 20 to the power of 20 possible peptides that you could generate. That is a huge number. So it would be impossible to test all of that in a lab. And even a small fraction of that is still intractable. So yeah, that's out of the question. And then you mentioned this idea where you can look at proteins that are already known to engage in interactions and maybe take a part of that as a starting point. That is essentially what we're doing, but inside a computer. So we're saving time by screening whether something, a peptide is likely to bind to a target in a computer instead of doing the actual experiments directly. The experiments will end up being done in the end anyways, but the idea of this software program is that we can identify which peptides are most likely to yield good results when we go and test them in the lab. So we do end up saving some time by reducing the number of peptides that are worth investigating in vitro. So with lab experiments.
Do you believe that in due time, let's say 10, 15 years from now, that this software will be able to replace lab testing completely? Or is it just at a point right now where it will continue to be capable of, let's say, you have 100 possible sequences, and then you bring them down to 5, and then you take the 5 and test them in the lab? Do you think that will always be the approach, or is the point to just go completely in silico?
Yeah, that's a good question. Personally, I don't think lab validation is ever going to go away. I mean, when you're going to be delivering these peptides to people, well, you first of all need to show that it does what you expect it to do. And no matter how good the algorithms are, you're still going to need that certainty, right? That it does what you expect it to do. And I cannot see people trusting software enough to just, be injected with peptides that have never been validated in a lab. And I don't think that the health authorities will allow therapeutic products to be delivered to people or used without, in-depth validation experiments and testing. So I don't think that it's in the foreseeable future that we will be able to replace these validation experiments. But it is possible that the algorithms get good enough that we only need to test very few peptides in the lab before we get very good hits. That might be in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Scientists that work at the bench just probably got a sigh of relief that they won't be replaced anytime soon.
Yeah.
Then in terms of Darwin AI, there are a lot of things to consider when trying to model how a peptide might behave, how it might interact with a receptor. So there are things like thermodynamics, amino acid bond distances, what are the inter or intramolecular forces that are in the vicinity, for example, that can be controlled by different interactions, hydrophobicity, and I'm sure there are others that can be listed. How is it able to model these interactions?
As you just said, the physical phenomena that control or modulate the binding of a peptide to a protein target are very complex. And in building algorithms, normally you need to make some sort of simplifications or assumptions. Otherwise, the problem quickly becomes intractable. So in the case of Darwin, we decided to go the sequence-based route, essentially, which means that we don't look at proteins and peptides in terms of their atomic composition or their 3D structure. Instead, we look at them as string of amino acids. So they're essentially considered text. So we make the assumption that somewhere within that text, these physical interactions or properties are encapsulated. So we operate at that level with that assumption. But there are competitors out there that do not make these assumptions and build software that is more complex and that actually accounts for all these different things. So bond lengths and atomic distances, different types of bonds that occur within a molecule or between molecules. But typically these approaches are much more expensive in terms of computation. They are more complex. They require more data in order to be accurate. So we opted to not take that path. But I do think that there is room for both approaches and that perhaps they can be complementary. When we only look at proteins and peptides as strings of characters, and one where we look at them in terms of 3D arrangements of atoms that interact with physical interactions or chemical interactions.
What is the biggest limiting factor? Because I imagine you have to have a sufficient sample data set in order to train your model on visualizing and predicting interactions. So what is the limiting factor of the type of data that you can train it on?
In the case of Darwin, we trained our algorithm on these large databases of protein-protein interactions. And these databases are not as big as we would want them to be, because going out in the lab and actually verifying whether two proteins interact is actually quite challenging and resource intensive. There are different methods that one can use to prove that two proteins interact, but you have to rule out certain possibilities, for example, that two proteins interact non-specifically, or you have this other challenge where you may not be able to show that two proteins interact, but only because you did not optimize the conditions for this interaction to occur. It's actually quite challenging and expensive to prove that proteins interact. So we're limited in that sense. So the size of the data sets that we use is mostly limited by resources.
Now, when you're trying to test interactions, you're doing it based off of crystallized protein structures that are available in databases?
There are several protein structures or crystal structures of proteins that are shown to be in complex with another protein or some sort of ligand. But this is not really the kind of data that we would be using as people who only look at protein sequences. We tend to just look at data in the format protein A interacts with protein B, and this has been shown using this biochemical method. And that's all we really need. But we could also use these structures, but it provides us with a lot of detail that we wouldn't know how to use really, or that is not very useful for our method.
I remember we talked a little bit about DeepMind and their program AlphaFold and how they use different available protein structures to model interactions. I was kind of curious, do you think that the limiting factor of having, for example, transmembrane proteins, they're fairly unstable as I understand, and they're difficult to crystallize. Is it possible to develop methods to fix these proteins in space so that they can actually be used as training models?
In terms of using artificial intelligence to model those, well, that's quite difficult because, as you know, these learning algorithms or artificial intelligence systems need training data, and it's very difficult to obtain that training data for proteins like transmembrane proteins, which few of them have been crystallized. So these are still challenging for algorithms to get right.
Right. So then if there isn't data to train the machine learning model on how to solve a problem, then it won't be able to solve the problem.
Exactly. So the way the learning systems are now, you typically need data to learn from, and then you can extrapolate from that or interpolate from that. But if you don't have that data, it's going to be very difficult.
And in your words, what do you think the big picture is of solving how proteins fold would be? What are the biggest benefits of that?
Well, there's been a lot of enthusiasm about the protein structure prediction problem being solved. And I'm being careful here not to say protein folding, because folding is a process that we still don't fully understand. So these very successful models can predict how a protein is organized in terms of its 3D structure, but how it gets there is still very, very much unclear. So yeah, we've had a lot of success with that, and there's been some enthusiasm, and rightly so, because that will have implications in terms of being able to design drugs, for example, or design new proteins. So if we're able to take a protein sequence and predict how it will fold in 3D space, well, then we may be able to design sequences that will achieve protein structures that can do something interesting. We could essentially build these tiny robots, or we could build enzymes that catalyze a reaction that we're interested in. And yeah, so there's been some recent developments with that, so it's very exciting. So it's very hard to overstate how being able to accurately predict the 3D structure of a protein is going to be impactful.
Because it really gets into the field of designer enzymes.
Yeah.
In the sense that currently any type of enzyme, whether it's extracted or made in the lab, it's not actually as a process of making it from scratch. It's grown in a different organism.
Yep. It's overexpressed.
Right. And that's how they take it and use it for other things. So then in the case of these machine learning models, these large language models, how do they work? What is the magic behind them?
Yeah, so the large language models, as you may know, were initially trained to process language, so large bodies of text, and they've been very successful at it. And they are all based on this very important principle or concept in machine learning that's called attention, and more particularly self-attention, which is this idea that different elements within a sequence, so for example, texts are sequences of words or characters, and there's this idea of attention is that there is meaning that can be derived from how the different elements in the sequence interact with each other. So they all influence each other within this broad sequence. So I can take this example where we might say something like, George drove to the bank. And the word bank here, the meaning should be pretty clear that it's some sort of financial institution. But then I could also say George swam to the nearest bank, and then this is a different meaning for the word bank. But then to know what bank means, you have to look at other elements in the sentence.
Context.
Yeah, context. So essentially, attention is this mechanism that allows one to capture context better than previous methods. And it's how attention is carried out that has unlocked this new revolution in large language models, because we can capture context in very large bodies of text, and we can do it very fast because a lot of attention is parallelizable within computers. The computations can be done in parallel as opposed to in series as it was done with previous methods. And the attention mechanism also allows context to capture elements that are very far apart within a sequence. So for example, if you have a large paragraph, an element at the end of the paragraph may still retain context from elements that are very early in the paragraph, which was something that was difficult to do with previous approaches in machine learning. So this is really what underpins the large language models right now. So this principle of attention.
I hear different numbers being thrown out for different language models and how many X billion neural network components they have. I don't imagine the number grows as they teach it more information or as they provide it with like different data sets. So what is growth? What is it learning progressively that is actually changing the way it is capable of conceptualizing these concepts, these prompts that you give it?
When you're talking about these components, we typically refer to them as parameters. These are essentially numbers that are learned by the neural network as it is trained or as it sees data. And these numbers are tweaked so that the model can correctly predict an output based on some input. Typically, the models have a fixed number of parameters. As we provide it with more and more data, the parameters change so that they get better at predicting an expected output given an input. The more data that you have, the better your model should be. But in terms of models progressing through time, well, there are changes to architectures of the models. We see that all the time where Facebook or OpenAI comes up with this new model, which is essentially small tweaks on the previous one, but they've increased the number of parameters by a lot because they have more data to learn more parameters. And that's really a big constraint. So if you want to make your model bigger, well, you need more data to train it. Otherwise, your model is just going to learn by heart what it is shown. And that's what we call overfitting in machine learning terminology. So really, a lot of the progress these past few years has just been making models bigger in terms of the number of parameters that they have and providing them with more data. That applies to things like GPT-3 and GPT-4, ChatGPT, which are all large language models.
As I understand, it is in open source. It is a large community of individuals that share their progress on either their own models or different programs that they help solve problems for. How long do you see this open source model remaining for, this form of sharing information?
The machine learning community and deep learning communities, they all work under the assumption that colleagues will be sharing knowledge that they acquire through experiments and that they'll be sharing their models and insight that they get through training models for different tasks. And that has been the case for some time. And at this point in time, I don't think it's really going to change. We still get access to models by large companies for which I wonder why they are choosing to give everyone access to these models or this knowledge, knowing that they could very well profit from it if they were to keep it closed source or hidden. But for some reason, it just seems like it's working and everyone benefits from having software libraries and methodologies shared throughout the community. And that's something that profits society as a whole because that allows research to go faster. So we're going to be able to come up with solutions to problems faster if everyone is able to share what they learn and to share tools that they use to solve these problems. There's a lot of reasons to be enthusiastic about how open source is what the community seems to be embracing these days.
I find that it is a very great environment because it fosters sharing. It fosters different individuals thinking about the same problem from different eyes, different perspectives. So solutions and advancements can be made faster. The reason why I brought that question up is because my main fear when it comes to AI, not necessarily a Terminator, like world, but more so what perhaps one company that has lots of power, lots of money to be able to develop larger models, to have a monopoly on it should they choose not to have an open source system. And as you mentioned, I don't know either why they would choose to have an open source model, but I'm happy about it because it gets everybody involved. But that would be my main fear of AI. What would yours be?
So right now, I'm very concerned about AI in education. That's something that really concerns me as someone who's working with students, and I just see these systems being made available to everyone, for anyone to use, and I can see them being used as a way to avoid hard work. It affords many students with the ability to answer questions in a quiz without having to really understand what the question is asking and how you go about solving the problem. So you can now just go on this website and ask ChatGPT what is the answer to this problem. And that's something that I've been dealing with recently. And that's something that concerns me a lot, because we're going to be, these people are going to, hit the real life, and there are going to be problems that cannot be solved yet by AI or machine learning, and that are going to need human input. But if they don't learn the basics, well, how are they going to be able to come up with novel ideas or novel solutions to problems? Because at this moment, these machine learning systems, they can only really provide solutions to problems that have already been solved, or they can only distill knowledge that is already known and accessible out there. But it is not going to solve new problems that are difficult, so non-trivial problems. So that's very concerning. That I would say that's one of my big concerns right now.
I agree with you because it does seem to be like a double-edged sword, where on one hand, students can abuse it. They can, like you said, just use it to basically cheat, write their own essays or assignments or what have you. And then on the other hand, it could be used as a learning tool where it aids you in research and helps you maybe dig deeper into a topic. Because I like its ability to summarize things. Now, albeit sometimes it does have mistakes and errors where information isn't fully accurate. However, I do think that it could be used well in a educational setting. This may be controversial, but let's say you had a camera over a class and that camera was operated by AI. Maybe at a certain point, AI will be able to monitor video, and it can notice a class of 15 students or 30 students, let's say. And there's one teacher. That teacher might not be capable of paying attention to every single student to make sure that, they're all paying attention to class, they're all learning at the same rate, because everybody's different. At the same point, the teacher may not be able to teach the students in the way that the students can learn. What I mean by that is we all have our different ways of learning, and the same method of teaching doesn't apply to all the students. So perhaps if there is a student that's falling behind, the AI might be able to tell them that these approaches to learning by, let's say, workshops or assignments is better for this student, and this type of learning method is better for that student. So I find that there is some approach to using it for education in that sense, but then that brings up privacy problems. Because if you have AI that is capable of viewing video, then how do you limit the accessibility it has?
Yeah, I mean, privacy is a very big concern in the ethics of artificial intelligence from many perspectives. One being, for example, well, these systems are going to need to somehow acquire the data and perhaps store it. How do we make sure that this data is not accessible to everyone, or that it's very well protected? And that's a challenge for any kind of private data stored. Even then, having these systems look at you and how you act, essentially executing surveillance, is something that I can understand some people might be uncomfortable with, and rightly so.
Rightfully so, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be considered as we're building and deploying these systems. But I like your point that AI in education is sort of this double-edged sword. In that I brought up this concern of students using this as a mean to avoid hard work. I mean, it can be used to, similarly to medicine, where there's this personalized medicine where we tailor medications and treatments to different patients. Well, we could tailor curriculums or exercises or assignments for specific students so that they can address, the weaknesses of a specific student, so that each student learns optimally based off of what they understand, what they do not fully grasp.
Something that Lex Friedman had mentioned, which was thought-provoking, is that in the sphere of job replacement for AI. So when you think of, for example, the current GPT-4, I think, is the one that's currently being used, at least the paid one, or free on Bing. If it's capable of writing, let's say, semi-good code that can, write a script, and that script runs. As basic as that script is, if let's say you have one coder that, and this is the point that he brings up, if as a coder, he is capable, let's say, of doing 5 times more work, is 5 times more productive, would that mean that then you need 5 times less people? Because if you're able to increase productivity with one person and you're able to decrease the time it takes to solve a task, then logically one would think that you would need less people. So it can lead to displacement of jobs. What's your take on job replaceability when it comes to AI?
You can view it in many different ways, right? So you can look at it as AI allowing companies to get rid of people. And that is probably true in spaces where there is not necessarily a whole lot of demand. But you could also view these new advances in AI as a way to increase revenues while keeping the same number of employees, where instead of cutting down the number of employees, you could keep the same number of employees, but having them be 10 times as efficient with these AI systems, which would, in the long run, probably earn the company more revenue than by cutting the number of employees they have. So yeah, so it's probably going to be industry dependent how that works. But yeah, there are multiple ways to look at that.
That's a good point. I just hope that it is one of these revolutions that ends up producing more jobs than it removes. Much like the agricultural or the industrial revolution gave more jobs than it replaced. I just hope that AI kind of runs in the same category.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on top of that AI may give rise to jobs that we cannot conceive of, that we can't think of right now. There are many jobs that exist now as a result of technology that people could never have imagined would exist before these technologies existed. So an MRI technician before, the advent of MRIs and scanners and these kinds of things, no one would have thought that could be a job because the technology didn't exist. So now that we are going to have these AI systems, well, there might be new jobs that are created for people to operate them or to maintain them that we really can't think of right now.
That's a good point, because we don't know what it can create outside of the things that we already use it for. I'd like to ask you a few more questions about your future aspirations. You would like to become a professor. It's a very noble thing to do, because you tend to be, or professors tend to be on not only teaching, but they also do different types of research that involves advancing their current state-of-the-art field that they're in. If you can tell me in your own words, what is the research that you would like to do?
I've been doing research right now for several years in the applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning for peptide design, which is something that I thoroughly enjoy. But I've been interested more and more in the applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning to study neurodegenerative diseases. And I'm particularly interested in this one disease called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is the long name for ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. So this is a really fascinating disease, which is poorly understood and that is very terrible. And you may have heard of it as a result of the Ice Bucket Challenge, which is this worldwide phenomenon that hit everywhere on the planet, and that allowed us to raise a lot of money for ALS research. So I'm interested in like pushing the boundary of knowledge for that specific illness because, as I said, it's horrible. We need more treatments for it.
Could you explain to us the onset of the disease and what are the symptoms like and what are the treatment options available for individuals impacted by it?
Fortunately, over the last 30 years or so, there have been some options that these patients can explore. But first, let's talk a bit about what it is. So this disease can essentially be summarized as the degradation of this type of neurons called motor neurons. And these are brain cells that carry out signals from your brain to your muscles. So essentially, whenever you want to carry out any type of movement, well, your motor neurons are what carry the signal from your brain to your fingers and your toes or your legs. And whenever these neurons start dying, well, then you slowly start to become paralyzed. So often the onset of this disease is going to start in a foot where you may become unable to walk without your foot dragging on the ground. So that's one typical type of onset. You may have some trouble with fine movement in your hands. You may lose dexterity. At first, it may seem fairly benign, so a lot of people will delay going to see a doctor. But over time, the symptoms progress and the paralysis moves from one area of the body to the other. And typically, the diseases over a period of 3 to 5 years will lead the person to experience symptoms of respiratory failure. And this is typically how people succumb to the disease. And yeah, so it's unfortunately a terminal illness at this point in time. But we're hoping that we can turn this into a chronic illness. And so far, there has been some progress over the last 30 years. First major development in terms of therapies happening in the early 90s, where they came up with this drug that could extend life by several months, which can be cancer durable in an illness that people have for 3 to 5 years. And then recently, over the past 5 years or so, there have been 2 or 3 therapies that were shown to be somewhat effective in slowing down the progression of the illness, often by rates of about 30%. So yeah, we're on our way to better treatments, but I think that machine learning and artificial intelligence are tools that could very much increase the pace of discovery for treatments for these diseases. And that's not limited to ALS. All major neurodegenerative diseases are very complex and they have different populations of patients that experience different maybe symptoms, or the disease may have a different cause, but they may manifest the same way. So if we're able to determine, well, this group of patients is likely to respond to this type of treatment, and this group of patients is likely to respond to that type of treatment because their disease has this particular genetic signature, well, then we may be able to better address the needs based off specific genetic makeups, for example.
Which is essentially personalized medicine approach.
Exactly.
Where I would hope that we get to a point where maybe sequence someone's genome and be able to put it in a simulation and you give a drug that has been made and discovered in the simulation to see how the person reacts to the drug. Maybe be able to even have it advanced enough to realize certain permutations of that drug that can actually be compatible or more compatible with that person. Do we know if there are any predispositions or genetic markers that make somebody more at risk for ALS? Is it heritable in any way?
For ALS, about 10% of cases are linked to a family history. Often in these cases, the person will know that they're at risk because they have a parent, they have an uncle or a grandparent that has succumbed to the disease. So these people will typically know that they are at risk because many people in their family will have had the disease. But for the remaining 90%, the cause is not necessarily well known. There is no specific genetic marker that would allow us to predict that they will develop the disease at any point in time. So it strikes seemingly at random. That's not to say that genes don't play a role in these people. It is very likely that, your genetic makeup is what puts you at risk. But like many diseases, we like to think of ALS as your genes being your finger on the trigger and environmental factors being, you pulling the trigger. So there's these two components that need to happen for you to experience the disease. There's about 90% of cases that happen seemingly at random, which we call sporadic cases, and about 10% that are linked to hereditary factors that are clearly defined. Oh, you are very much at risk because you carry this gene mutation.
I wish you all the best in that endeavor, and I'm sure you'll make a great professor.
Thank you very much.
Just to kind of zoom out a little bit from science, I was interested, as you mentioned earlier, talking about audiograms. You have a particular hobby on the side that you like to play music and record songs. So I kind of interested in how did you get into that, and how does someone in your situation, a PhD student studying at the same time, how do you even have time for that?
Well, I mean, you have to make time for it because it's not going to, if you don't, well, it's easy for research to take up all of your time. So I try to set aside a couple hours every day where that's all I do, write music and record music. And I started playing around the age of 12. And I remember throughout high school thinking, oh, well, I'm going to be this rock star. Music is my passion. I'm going to become famous and all that. And then, you grow up and you realize that that's not an easy path. And I also enjoyed science. So I was like, well, maybe science will offer me more security. So I took that route, but I wasn't willing to give up on music altogether. So I've been writing songs since I was about 18, and I still do to this day. And honestly, I have a hard time understanding how someone can go through grad school without any kind of hobby or something on the side, because it's so easy to just get engulfed by your research and to forget that there are other things to life. So yeah, music is, honestly, it's always been there for me. I'm not willing to let it go, even if I'm very passionate about what I do.
I commend you about that. It's good to find time to enjoy other hobbies, to be able to always have a fresh mind coming back to research the next day. Some final words from you to individuals, to students, young people that are studying at university right now that would like to get into machine learning, that would like to get into computer science. Do you have any advice on pursuing this path?
Yeah, I would say if that's something that interests you, I would say go for it. There had never been this many resources for people out there to learn about machine learning and learn about computer science and how to code. Anyone can do it. All you need is a little bit of motivation, effort, and that's pretty much it, honestly. If you want to do it, go for it. It's even if that doesn't end up being an important part of your career, that's not something that I can imagine someone regretting doing. It's a set of skills that is broadly applicable. And here I'm talking mostly about coding or learning about computers. There is no way that you will not be able to find something in your life that can benefit from you knowing how to program a computer.
What would you say to a student that may think it's getting too late to learn how to code because by the time I'm, let's say, getting into a career, Chat GPT 15 or whatever number iteration that they would be at the time can do it far better than I can? What's the point?
Like professional programmers also have that concern, but there will always be a need, I think, for people to come up with new ideas and new algorithms. And yeah, granted, if you're learning a bit later, it may be a bit more difficult to use that as part of your job, but I think you will always benefit from knowing these things for yourself. And knowing how to code is also just fun. You can build stuff, and you should also consider doing it or learning it just for the sake of having fun building something new or something that is interesting to you, because that may not exist. People have all kinds of interests, and there are tons of tools and games, and there's a bunch of computer programs that people can develop that will be new and interesting. And I'm sure that if you think about it a little, you'll find something that you can come up with that will be new and that you will enjoy and that other people might enjoy too. So I would say go for it. It's never too late to learn.
Encouraging words. I would like to ask you the closing question of today's podcast. As a scientist, who is your favorite scientist that is most inspirational to you, and why?
I often like to cite Rosalind Franklin. So I had mentioned briefly earlier when I was talking about how I came to learn programming, I mentioned this website called Rosalind, which had these challenges in bioinformatics that people could solve and to learn how to program. So it's actually named after her. So Rosalind Franklin is this British scientist who is credited with taking the first X-ray picture of a DNA crystal. And this photo was instrumental in figuring out the structure of DNA, which Watson and Crick are credited with uncovering in a famous Nature paper. But one thing that, I find difficult to accept is that her work is vastly under-acknowledged and unrecognized, even though it was really critical to being able to solve the structure of DNA. And for people who don't know, that picture shows essentially an X. So this particular pattern in X-ray crystallography is something that you would observe in a helix, which is what allowed Watson and Crick to say, oh, wow, well, this is the DNA is likely a helix. So she was not awarded the Nobel Prize. I believe at that point she had already passed away. And also she's a female scientist, which there were not that many of them that were very influential at that time. I could also mention Marie Curie, but yeah, that I often think of Rosalind Franklin, and I've actually named my cat after her. So Rosalind is one of my cat's names.
Thank you very much. Great scientist, ahead of her time, and I would like to really appreciate you for your time. Thank you for being on the podcast, and all the best with your future endeavors.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thanks for listening, everyone.